we are going to look at catch crops. So a catch crop is a crop that you grow in between two of your main crops. They tend to be fast growing things, and mainly, sometimes they're actually called fodder crops because mainly we use them for animal feed. Um, the examples that we tend to use in Ireland would be some kale and some stubble turnips and some rape as well. Now, the advantages of catch crops, there's loads. They tend to be fast growing and high yielding. Your stubble turnips in particular are very fast growing, so you can get an additional crop in there at a time when your land wouldn't be doing anything, and it doesn't affect your main crops, doesn't put them out of kilter too much. That allows you to extend the grazing season. It also gives you better control of weeds. A lot of these crops tend to be from your cruciferae family, so they are nice and leafy, and if you've ever grown cabbages or anything like that, you'll notice that they give good ground cover, and because they give good ground cover, you are keeping the weeds down. It gives you better use of nutrients in the soil, and some of them have a high protein content. In particular, there your kale would have a good high protein content. They add organic matter to the soil, and this is particularly true if you plough them back in when you're done. They protect the soil structure against heavy rain, so it means that you have roots in the soil at times of heavy rainfall, and of course that improves the structure of the soil and gives a bit of a protection to the soil against the effects of the rain and against leaching of minerals. Some of them can add nutrients to the soil, mineral nutrients to the soil, like your legumes. Legumes, if you remember, have little nodules on their roots, and those nodules have a bacteria that produce nitrogen, so they're adding nitrogen to the soil. It helps to conserve soil moisture. Again, that goes back to just having roots in there. And it gives additional winter feed, which is the biggest one. That's the main reason we do this, is to have additional winter feed, which will reduce the cost of your concentrates over the winter. Now, the disadvantages, there are some. They can be quite labour intensive, particularly if you are strip grazing them, which would be recommended, or if you're zero grazing them during the winter. That's quite a lot of work. Many catch crops then are low in fibre, so if they're low in fibre, you're going to have to supplement there with hay or silage, which means that you're doing a kind of a combined feeding regime, which again ups the labour involved. They can be vulnerable to attack from pests and diseases. Generally, though, that's not a major problem if you are practicing good crop rotation, which most farmers do, and we'll give you an example of that towards the end. There'd be certain examples that wouldn't be very economical. For instance, if you had a still productive ryegrass, you're not going to go sowing a catch crop after that, unless you had, of course, planned to reseed it if the productivity of the ryegrass was falling and you're planning to reseed anyway. So they're not suitable for all applications. There's a risk of poaching the land. For instance, if you had your stubble turnips, which we're about to look at in a few minutes, and you were grazing them during the months of November, the stubble turnips are grazed in situ, so you would have animals on your land during a wet month of November, which could lead to poaching. And then iodine deficiency is often a problem with the brassicas or the cruciferae, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. So our first example then is the stubble turnip, and you can see there by the massive leaves on the stubble turnip that this particular one is a hybrid there, and you can see it belongs to your cruciferae family with the massive big leaves, so it should remind you of a cabbagey looking plant because it is related to them. Okay. So stubble turnips then belong to the cruciferae family, as I mentioned. They're a great catch crop. The main reason being that they grow really quickly, only 12 to 14 weeks to give you a good yield of a really nutritious and palatable feed. Now, they can go in the spring, and if they do go in the spring, then you'll have them for feeding in late summer, or more commonly, we would put them in there in July, maybe after winter barley, and then they'll be there for feeding in October to February, probably around November. They're not very winter hardy, so if you get frosts, you will lose your stubble turnip. So the soil suitability then. Stubble turnip likes a free draining soil with a pH of above 6.5. So a nice free draining loam will help your stubble turnip to grow. Of course, that's a good soil for any crop that you'd be growing, really. Certainly any of the cereals would prefer a nice free draining loam as well. The soil must be suitable for grazing. I mentioned earlier that your stubble turnip is not one that you harvest, it's one that you graze in situ, meaning you actually bring in the animals to eat it there in strip grazing usually. So the seeding rates, now that's going to depend on your sowing conditions and the method that you use for sowing as well. So if you are using broadcast sowing, you're looking at about 8 kilograms per hectare, and if you are direct drilling, you are looking at maybe 5 kilograms per hectare. They can be broadcast just straight in to the stubble that's left after cereal, after you rotivate and harrow. That means you're not doing any ploughing before them. In fact, you don't want to overdo the working of the soil, because if you do, you can have moisture loss from the soil if you overwork it, and moisture loss will lead to a reduction in the yield. And then some varieties that you might see in Ireland. You have Typhon, Delilah and Barkant. Now the fertiliser requirements then, it depends obviously on the soil index, what you're going to need, but typically you could be in the region of 70 to 90 kilograms of nitrogen when you're sowing them per hectare, and then you might top up nitrogen afterwards again as top dressing, and then phosphorus and potassium 30 to 35 kilograms per hectare for phosphorus, and potassium 35 to 40 kilograms per hectare. Now, what kind of diseases and pests are we talking about? Flea beetles are a big one. Also slugs, as you would expect with anything in the cruciferae family. Any of those brassicas tend to have problems with slugs, and leather jackets, which we've mentioned throughout the crop section. What you do to deal with all of those, well, you spray with insecticide as soon as you see any sign of them at all. Then in terms of diseases, clubroot is quite a common one, and again that's for any members of the cruciferae family. The main way of avoiding that is to have a good crop rotation, only ever sow them like 1 in every 3 years. And then powdery mildew, which again any leafy veg will be susceptible to powdery mildew, and particularly when you're sowing them early. Now, feeding information then. So if you're going to use these, what do you need to consider? Generally, you would use them a lot. They're used a lot for ewes, and also used by fattening lambs, depending on the time of year that you're utilising them. Then utilisation of the bulbs by sheep and cattle can be poor, especially if the bulbs are small. Strip grazing works best. I think I'd mentioned that already, and it's really important to introduce the stock gradually to allow their rumens to get used to grazing stubble turnips. They can take maybe 3 weeks to adjust to them in the diet. Now, on top of that, they're going to need some source of fibre because they are a little bit low on fibre, so you'll need to give them access to some silage or some hay as well. And of course, you've got to think about that if you're grazing them out there in November and it's wet, you want to try and get in there when it's relatively dry with your hay, so that your tractor isn't damaging the land. You'll also need to do some mineral supplementing. They would tend to be low in iodine in particular, and so you'll need to give a mineral supplement for that. The yield then and the feed quality. The average dry matter is 3.5 to 4 tonnes per hectare, average fresh yield 38 to 40, so that means it's an 8 to 9% dry matter. Your crude protein 17 to 18%, your digestibility up on 70%, and then the energy that is metabolizable is 11 megajoules per kilogram of dry matter. And that brings us on to another favourite of ours, kale. Now you could treat kale and rape probably together, but we're going to zero in a bit on kale. Again, they're both members of Cruciferae family, and they need to be grazed in situ by cattle and sheep. The intake of rape and kale by cattle should be restricted to avoid problems with nutritional red water, and also with iodine and phosphorus deficiency. Nutritional red water we'll be talking about a little bit later. Now the cultivation. So again, you want a free draining loam or a sandy loam even, with a pH of 6 to 7. It has a longer growing period than stubble turnip, which is a major disadvantage. It does best if you can give it like 6 months, which isn't always feasible, which is why the stubble turnip tends to be that bit more popular. It should be put in a 5-year rotation, and then you need to apply nitrogen when you're sowing it at maybe somewhere in the region of 75 to 85 kilograms per hectare, and you can split the nitrogen. You can put in some of it at sowing and some of it later as a top dressing. You will probably need phosphorus and potassium as well, but it'll depend on your soil index, which we've more than covered throughout the crop section. Again, just like the stubble turnip, it's best when it's strip grazed, and it's important to introduce your stock gradually. If you're going to give it to dairy cows, you need to make sure that it's no more than 30% of their intake, as it can cause problems with anemia or, again, red water that we mentioned before. In terms of the red water, the issue with your kale is that it has an amino acid that's a non-protein amino acid, and when that gets into the rumen, it can actually damage the red blood cells. And then why it's called red water is the red blood cells then release some of their hemoglobin into the urine, and so the urine will appear red. Now, as I said, if you can gradually introduce them and also make sure that it's not a huge proportion of their diet, no more than 30%, you should be able to avoid it. And also, if you make sure never to graze it when it's in flower. Sheep or cattle who are grazing kale will need hay or silage for fibre. We mentioned that it's low in fibre. And then you will probably need to supplement minerals again, phosphorus, manganese, and iodine in particular. Okay, the pests and diseases. The flea beetle is a big one, and also aphids attack it. So your green fly. What do you do with any of these? You spray with insecticide. Also, the seedlings can be prone to slugs. Again, as I mentioned, you're in your cabbage family here, and you always need to look out for slugs. Slugs love your leafy veg. Slug pellets can be used if needed. Then your yield. Average dry matter is 8 to 10 tonnes per hectare. Average fresh yield 60-65 tonnes per hectare, which gives you a dry matter percentage of about 14 to 15%. The crude protein then is around 16 to 17% of the fresh kale, or if you're insiding it, you're looking at a higher percentage, 19 to 25% maybe. Digestibility up there at 68%, and your metabolizable energy, again around the 10 or 11 megajoules per kilogram of dry matter. Finally, then, how do we use them in Ireland? You've two main examples that you'd be looking at. Either you'd be sowing your early potatoes, and then you might put in your rape for winter grazing, and then you'd sow a winter cereal after that. Or you could be looking at after your winter barley, so somewhere there out in June, July time, when you've harvested your winter barley, you can again put in rape or kale for winter grazing, and then you can follow that on with your spring cereal or your potatoes. And that is it on the catch crops.